Hello and welcome to the Rhino Conspiracy, a special event hosted by Save the Rhino International. I'm Riz Khan and I'll be your host for the next hour or so as we grab your neurons and hold your attention. We're pleased to welcome more than 100 people who've signed up from over 20 countries, including the UK, USA, Canada, Israel, Brazil, Australia and the Philippines. And we would ask you to feel free to offer your questions to our panel. Just add them to the comment box on whichever platform you're using, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or Tiltify, and so on. Now, this event is called The Rhino Conspiracy because that's the title of a new book just out, written by Peter Hain, or if I use the right protocol, it's the Right Honourable, the Lord Hain PC. Well, the title doesn't go anywhere near to describing this remarkable man who's had an incredibly colourful life as a very vocal activist and leading British politician, having been born and raised in in Africa, mostly South Africa, before moving to Britain. Now, his life story would in itself be a book. For now, we'll settle for the intriguing story that is described as a fictional thriller, but may reflect reality far more than anything else. To dig deeper into exactly how real and to get some idea on the rhino poaching situation, we also have with us Julian Rademeyer, the Director for East and South Africa at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Julian worked as a journalist before making his mark in the battle against wildlife crime, having also worked at Traffic, the International Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network. He authored a 2012 book, Killing for Profit, exposing the illegal rhino horn trade. And also with us is the wonderful Cathy Dean, CEO of Save the Rhino International, a job she's adeptly handled for almost 2 decades now. So she's very well placed to take us through the latest information on how things stand for that beautiful and prehistoric creature that's so ignorantly and brutally killed for its horn. Plus, she's also one of the lucky ones who got to an early copy of the book, The Rhino Conspiracy. So let's find out more. I'm going to start off with the man himself, Peter Hain, so we can get some background on this book. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Save the Rhino to hosting me for this.
Totally, and I hinted at your colourful life at the start of the introduction. Everything from having been an activist, very vocal activist, and also climbing to quite a high level in the British political system. Now, what made you want to write a book that, let's say, to quote the blurb, talked about a corrupt South African government that turns a blind eye to the international trade in rhino horn?
Well, Riz, thank you, and to all those watching as well. 5 years ago, after I'd retired as a member of Parliament and before I went to the Lords, I went with my wife Elizabeth to the wonderful game reserve Tula Tula in KwaZulu-Natal, and we were watching rhinos there, chomping away peacefully, and noticing that there were guards, 2 guards, 24/7 armed guards on them. And it was explained to me by the game rangers that the bullets fired at these rhinos, not them particularly, but rhinos in general, by poachers, explode in them, and their flesh breaks out, and these royal specimens fall on the ground writhing, and then their horns are yanked out of them in a bloody way. And I started to look a bit at poaching. I read Julian Rademeyer's book, Killing for Profit, which is a great book. And at the same time, I was becoming increasingly worried as somebody who'd been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. My parents bravely were jailed and banned and finally were forced into exile in 1966. And seeing the way that under the former President Zuma, corruption just spread like a cancer through government, betraying the values of the freedom struggle of Nelson Mandela. And I decided to try to write a thriller, which is this one, the Rhino Conspiracy, which tried to explain in a way that I hope people who support Save the Rhino and also who are interested in what's happening in South Africa at the moment, where we have a new president who's doing his best to reverse all of that, to try and write it in a readable way. Because at the end, I also discovered, and this would be familiar to many of you watching, or Cathy, certainly from Save the Rhino, that at the end of this is not just, at the end of the poaching, is not just a criminal network, but also corrupt politicians who allow it to happen throughout Africa, and consumers in Vietnam and China and elsewhere in East Asia who use the rhino horns ground down for them into powder as an aphrodisiac, allegedly, or as a cocaine substitute, or to nurse hangovers. All these ridiculous and mythical sort of treatments that they think they can indulge in. These rich elites are paying enormous sums that then go all the way down to these local poachers who do the dangerous job, and you can't acquit them at all, but they're often very, very poor Africans. You've got to look at the top, and I suppose that's the message of this thriller.
I'm going to get onto corruption a little later in our conversation, Peter, but I just want to ask you quickly, how, you know, the Rhino Conspiracy is a fictional mystery thriller, but how much license do you feel you took as an author to be able to kind of depart from the reality on the ground in order to make that fictional novel?
Well, I relied a lot on my own experience and my knowledge of the anti-apartheid struggle. And some of the characters, there's a character called the Veteran in it, who was based on a real freedom fighter, an underground leader. And I use him and his story as a way into that part of the struggle. And then, of course, there's then a heroine called Thandi Majeka, who's based I picture her as the grandchild of an African woman we knew very well. So there's an interweaving of my own knowledge, but also of reality in terms of the way that the big picture above local poaching, trying to destroy these fantastic rhinos and threaten their species with extinction. The bigger picture is the one that is more familiar to me, which is the politics behind it. For example, a member of parliament exposing it in the British Parliament, as I did over corruption several years ago under President Zuma, using parliamentary privilege because you can't be sued then. So there's this bigger picture, but it's based on a lot of real life things and real life characters, and of course real life incidents in game reserves.
So thanks. That's where I'm going to bring in Cathy Dean, who has had the advantage of getting her hands on a copy of the book, which I haven't been able to yet. It's coming out on the 10th of September, just so you all know. Let's get an idea how close the words on the pages reflect the boots on the ground, so to speak. Cathy, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I had a very happy August bank holiday weekend on the sofa with a copy of the Rhino Conspiracy. I think one of the things that really struck me is Julian's book, Killing for Profit, which was 2012, if I remember right, that I read a few years ago. And then in theory, that is non-fiction. And in theory, Peter's book written this year is fiction. But there are incidents in both that you think, surely that's a swerve, surely it's crossed. You know, Julian had got extraordinary tales about Thai prostitutes being shipped in and bought hunting trophy licenses so that they could legitimately shoot trophy hunt rhinos and then be used as mules to courier the horns back. Peter has got fictional stories about senior South African politicians and their involvement in hand-delivering horns to the Vietnamese embassy. Whether you call those fiction or non-fiction, there is an absolute blurring between the boundaries between the two books. And I strongly recommend you read both. I think they go hand in hand very well. There are a lot of things I really recognized in the book. Obviously the exhaustion of the rangers, having to keep 24/7 guard on rhinos, the despair of rhino owners, be they state, private, as in the book, or community conservancies. How do you defend your rhinos when the poachers keep upping the ante? You know, it does become almost this arms race. To try and get one ahead. For me, one of the really key bits in the book was the realization that focusing on the level 1 poachers, the shooters who go into the reserves to kill the rhino, that's not going to solve the problem. You need to go higher up the chain. And so in the rhino world, we talk about 5 levels. So your level 2 will be the local courier. Your level 3 will be probably the person who consolidates horn and then arranges export. Level 4 is the exporter. Level 5 is the importer. And for me, where Peter's book got really interesting was going further up that chain, how, you know, there's the detail about I don't want to give too much away and spoil the plot, but how you go further up the chain and make arrests higher up. You know, it is said that the most effective way to interrupt the rhino horn trade is to take out the level 3, take out the people in the middle, and you can't get from the guys on the ground to the exporters and the importers. That's where you can have maximum impact.
Cathy, I asked this with no skepticism at all. To what degree, as someone who has to deal with the brutality of rhino poaching, do you feel it's okay for the issue to be fictionalized too?
I imagine the guys on the ground would absolutely welcome the attention given to it. I think those stresses and strains, and now obviously the book was finished before COVID-19 became an issue, but we've just been putting together the articles for the next issue of our annual magazine, and pretty well everyone is writing about the impact of COVID on top of poaching. You know, so we're hearing lots of stories of rangers who had been on duty for 6 solid weeks, were meant to go on off, and then lockdown happened, and, you know, lo and behold, they just have to keep working for another straight 3 months. You know, patrol deployments, everything have had to change. I think, it would make a great Christmas stocking present filler for all the guys we work with to read a copy of the book. They'd recognize a lot of it.
I'll touch on some of the issues with COVID and the pandemic lockdown a little bit later too, but I want to bring in Julian here. And Julian, you've spent a long time, obviously, following those trails of the rhino horn trade and the issues that surround it. And I know for a lot of people, that most people, I would say, are aware of the fact that there is something wrong, that rhinos are being poached and the horn is being used for various reasons. Even as a journalist, I was always aware of it. It was only when I got much more actively involved that I realized how serious the situation was. And I wonder how much you think that, of course, you've written about it in your book, specifically, but how much you feel that the Rhino Conspiracy might help to at least make it a more poignant issue for the average person who might not be following rhino poaching more closely.
I think you know, it's important in the sense that it reaches out to a readership who, you know, as Cathy was saying, want to curl up with a good novel, a good thriller. You know, I think that it covers a lot of real life issues, issues of corruption, which run across the length of the illicit supply chain of rhino horn. It touches on very real issues of politics, and I think that they're very real characters in this book. The veteran is one individual that Peter mentioned earlier. You know, and the pain that particular character feels about the impact of corruption in South Africa. You know, particularly the sort of devastating lost 10 years, for want of a better description, under President Jacob Zuma, and the crippling impact that had on law enforcement agencies, on intelligence agencies, on intelligence gathering. You know, the consequences of those years are something that we are going to be dealing with long into the future, particularly now with the economic devastation that's being wrought by COVID. So I think that there are things that you can do in fiction and tease out elements in some ways, you know, remain a fantasy. In fact, you know, with the book that I wrote years ago, many of the sort of wildlife trafficking networks that I was writing about, and subsequently to that, very little has actually happened to any of those networks. Very few of those people have been arrested or been prosecuted. And I think that with a book like this, you can really do, as Peter's done, is explore how do you go about tackling a transnational criminal network, you know, networks that have tentacles, that operate across multiple legal jurisdictions. They adapt far more quickly than law enforcement ever could. You know, the foot soldiers themselves, the poachers on the ground, are little more than cannon fodder. You know, they people who are easily exploited, easily replaced. So how do you go after those other levels, the sort of, you know, the operational levels, as Cathy was pointing out, the level 3s and the managerial levels? So I think that there's a lot of scope there where you can weave in threads that exist. I mean, for me, you know, writing about rhino poaching has never been writing about just saving a charismatic animal. It's been about much more than that. It touches on issues across the gamut of our societies: corruption, lack of law enforcement, land issues, you know, immense poverty in communities, the drivers that lead young men to go out into the bush and take risks to kill and die for a few kilograms of rhino horn. So I think they're very real world things that can be explored in that way. And I think Peter's done that in his book.
Of course, yeah, there's so many complexities people don't realize. Of course, it seems very simple that it's just simply killing a rhino. But as you point out, there's so many levels. Peter, on that note, to what degree did you actually think when you were writing the book that it might be something you wanted to do to actually raise the awareness?
Well, I hoped it would. And I hope because, I like thrillers. I read thrillers for relaxation. I read far too much stuff that is hard work in my job and in out of interest. But I read thrillers for a fast read, and I just hope that it will actually bring to a wider public things that they'd never thought of before, because I found out about it in writing it, and therefore I hope that in terms of Save the Rhinos campaigning, but also the issues that we've discussed and Julian's highlighted behind it, all of this, it's not just a fantastic species, but it's also what threatens it. And in the end, it's humankind that's threatening these species, including the rhino, and our behavior politically and the motivation to kill for profit and so on behind it all.
One thing I do want to do is try to get in, we've got so many people joining us obviously online with this. I want to try to get in some of the questions that our various participants from around the world are sending in. So if it's okay, I'm going to put a couple of these out there. Julian, perhaps put this to you first. It's from Jack Ingham in the United Kingdom, who writes, what is the illegal global trade in rhino horn worth?
Good question. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, efforts to try and put a figure on global illegal wildlife trade. None of it particularly sort of accurately, I think. We've, with the amounts that are being moved, you're looking at a significant trade. I mean, rhino horn itself has various figures have been bandied around. In the early stage of the poaching crisis, you were looking at prices being mentioned around $60,000 a kilogram. That has come down significantly, and we've actually seen a drop in rhino horn prices in recent years to current levels, which are quite low. Similarly with the ivory trade, but it's very difficult to quantify exactly how much that trade would be worth globally.
And Cathy, I could put this one to you from India. This question came in from Dr. Deba Datta, who says, how can we prevent the illegal rhino horn trade to save African and Asian rhino species? I mean, it's a broad question, but a couple of steps, perhaps.
Oh, Riz, if I knew the answer to that, we'd have done it 10 years ago. Yeah. It's got to be a combination of factors. So it is about improving law enforcement in the source countries. It's about making sure the rhinos you've got are breeding as fast as possible so that the offtake from poaching, the impact from that is lessened. It's about, addressing the demand for rhino horn in China, Hong Kong and Vietnam, the main users. And we've done work with partners in traffic and education for nature in Vietnam, and now with the Environmental Investigation Agency, looking at behavior change campaigns, but also about tightening and then enforcing legislation. Because if you've still got the demand in the user countries, you'll still have people willing to take the risk to make a fast buck illegally. Yeah, it's also about, better coordination between rhino protection agencies, whether that's at national, regional or local level. And crucially, it's about kind of making sure that communities in the broader sense, I'm not just talking about the neighbors living around the borders of a national park, that they see some benefit from rhinos, which might be financial, it might be aesthetic, it might be a wider sense of pride about their country's biological heritage. But unless you can have the best trained, equipped rangers in the world, but unless actually the people in the rhino range states broadly want to see their wildlife prosper, then we've lost, and we might as well stop now.
I think that's a really important point, just briefly, that the poachers, local Africans, often poverty-stricken, try to feed their families from local communities that are poverty-stricken. International governments, aid agencies and so on, should be trying to support alternative investment in economies around the game reserves, so that actually they're not just providing work for those local people in the game reserves, but they've got alternative forms of economic opportunities that mean these guys who risk their lives, and that's not in any way being sympathetic to them, a lot get killed, poachers, that they've actually got other jobs to go to.
And Peter, that's what I was going to pick up on, really, at that level, at the governmental level. How much more perhaps could be taken on? We're counting on Save the Rhino International and other organizations and the work that people like Julian do to try to create some kind of impact, to have some kind of impact. But surely there should be a little more governmental level intervention.
Yes, there should, both in the way that I described of, for example, Britain's Department for International Development, now subsumed under the Foreign Office, which was a leading anti-poverty body. It's no good just ministers saying, well, Save the Rhino is a fantastic campaign group, which it is, but saying, well, what are we going to do to help improve education, help improve economic opportunities in those communities right across Africa, which have game reserves with the rhinos in them. So there's that, and then there's also, this wouldn't be happening unless organized crime, unless a blind eye was turned to organized crime crossing borders, and what diplomatic efforts are being made in East Asia, in the countries that Cathy mentioned, to actually tackle the problem and work with their governments to make sure. So I think there's a lot that could be done at international governmental level that really there's not a lot of energy that I can see going into it.
And actually, on that note, Julian, a number of questions have come in regarding corruption. It's something we have just briefly touched on. But one of the issues that people are asking about is how can corruption be better dealt with, especially when it comes to dealing with international criminal syndicates that have links to political parties and to law enforcement officials.
Sure. I mean, that would be if we wouldn't be in the position we're in South Africa, if we had, if things had been implemented, or if we knew how to take those steps. I mean, I think that there are encouraging signs. I think that the president's taken quite a firm stand recently.
This is President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Ramaphosa, yeah, in response to widespread corruption, and particularly, in the case of recent allocations for combating COVID and dealing with COVID, where there was what appeared to be a sort of looting spree of corruption that took place. And I think it's something that he was absolutely appalled by, and tried to lay down the law. And I think that we, in a South African context at least, I think we're hitting a point where feelings of sort of hopelessness and helplessness during the Zuma years about the scale of corruption are starting to give way to a sense of real rage, where South Africans are sick and tired of seeing this going on, are sick and tired of seeing law enforcement agencies crippled, of senior politicians getting away with corruption. So I think that, and I think within some of the bodies that were crippled during the Zuma years, like the National Prosecuting Authority, like the Hawks, there are, which is a Director of Priority Crime Investigations, there are moves afoot to try and re-strategize and to rebuild up some of those investigative capacities, rebuild the intelligence capacities. But it's a very, very long game. And I think the difficulty here is that right across, across multiple legal jurisdictions, across multiple countries, corruption runs like a thread from the source of rhino horn right through to the consumer side of it. I think that there are also encouraging signs on the Asia side. I mean, certainly in China, we've seen growing numbers of arrests and prosecutions, some real sentences being handed down. Vietnam, Education for Nature Vietnam came up with a report recently looking at prosecutions there, and there's been a significant uptick in prosecutions. The sentences, however, leave a lot to be desired. But I think that there's some proactive stuff happening. I know, for instance, the Chinese law enforcement has sent delegations out to deal with some of their counterparts in Africa to collaborate on investigations, transnational investigations, and are also, not simply seizing a quantity of rhino horn or ivory at an airport and then arresting someone, but actually doing targeted investigations. Environmental Investigation Agency did their famous Shuidong Connection report and supplied information, for instance, to the Chinese government. And there were a number of targeted arrests from that. So I think those signs are quite encouraging. And I think that COVID in some ways has cast wildlife trade in sharp relief, not necessarily in terms of bans and crackdowns in China on traditional Chinese medicine uses of wildlife products, but certainly it's put the wildlife trade globally and the illegal wildlife trade globally in the spotlight.
Cathy, if there is any kind of gold standard when it comes to how certain nations have handled the illegal trade of rhino horn, is there anyone you can point to, any countries you can point to where you can say, look, they are doing it the right way, and perhaps these are good examples?
Poaching is pretty dynamic, and if one country hots up its response, they will look for the next soft target. And so when you look back at poaching stats, you'll see that Zimbabwe was the first target in 2008-9. Then it moved to South Africa, and from there to Namibia and Kenya. You know, Kenya's put in place some really good intel work. Namibia, again, has an excellent intel unit via the Blue Rhino Task Force, and with US government funding and other donors has embarked on an annual rhino dehorning program, strategically dehorning rhinos that are either in poaching hotspots or along in vulnerable areas. So it is dynamic. I mean, I just want to make the point that actually rhino crime is happening here in the UK as well. People may have heard about the Rathkeil Rovers, obviously not part of the UK, from Limerick in Ireland. But the Rathkeil Rovers have been targeting museums and galleries and zoo exhibits, private houses in the UK and Europe. And there was a prosecution, I think about 13 men were arrested and charged and convicted 3 years ago. Now, the total value of their crimes was worth more than the Hatton Garden robberies, so more than £60 million. Yet the sentences that they got were 2 to 3 years. I think there's a major education job to be done on the judiciary here in the UK. One of the so-called Rathkeil Rovers was extradited to the US. I think he was in jail waiting 9 months for his court hearing. He was convicted, and just last weekend, he was let out after just 3 months in jail and returned to Ireland. And there are pictures of him breaking lockdown rules, enjoying pints of beer with various friends in various pubs in Limerick. Now, I was just reading back on that case. He was essentially stealing old horn and probably recarving it and then passing it on to usually Chinese contacts. His character references when he appeared in court in Ireland first, one came from a London antiques dealer, the other came from a peer who his house had been robbed by a gang of Irish travellers not shortly before. How on earth, what is the weird connection between the antiques dealer and the peer whose house had been burgled, probably by the Irish travellers? I mean, it's a whole nother novel plot. Julian, Peter, I invite you. You know.
Cool. So on that note, Peter, from what you have learned, based on having to research the book and your experience, certainly in the work you've done as an activist, on this question of dehorning, Brad Gerndt from the United States wrote in to say, can dehorning help save rhinos? Is this a viable option to flood the market and make rhino poaching less appealing? What do you think?
Look, I'd defer to both Cathy and Julian on that, but the evidence on flooding the market, because the argument has been made for that, is kind of, I think, contradictory. It's supposed to reduce the price. It might actually fuel demand. And so Julian and Cathy probably know a lot more about it than I do, but I'm suspicious about that, to be quite frank.
Julian, do you want to chip in here?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of debate around it. I mean, I think it's probably the most contentious issue in conservation today, certainly in South Africa, and it divides people in straight groups. You've got the pro-trade, anti-trade lobbies, for want of a better description. And it's a debate that's been going on for years now with very little resolution. I mean, I think, the fact remains that in terms of CITES, the international trade is banned. It's unlikely that ban will be lifted anytime soon. That said, I do think that these are important debates that we should have because, there are many African countries who are sitting on stockpiles of rhino horn, who believe strongly that they have the right to do with that horn what they will, and that they should not be dictated to by the global community. And that could be a sense of revenue, but it's a kind of discussion on the merits and demerits of legalization that you could spend the next 3-4 hours discussing. Yeah.
Actually, it's great to see. I've been seeing a number of questions coming in from the people who are participating from around the world. And it's great to see how diverse and how widespread that the participant audience is. Raymond Messiter in South Africa has written in, and perhaps, Cathy, I could put this to you. Raymond says, why are suspects not brought to justice or held accountable for their involvement, whether directly or indirectly, as poaching kingpins?
Yeah, again, it's getting further up the chain because it's hard, but relatively speaking, simple to address the level one, the foot soldiers. Actually, the level one guys know who the level two guys are, but they don't know who's further up the chain. If you catch the level two, he might know the level one, the level three. It is harder to go up. I think Julian probably sits on this closer than I do, but I think there's a real problem with prosecutions in South Africa. There are a number of what are known as khaki collar criminals. There's sort of some trophy hunting professionals. Dawie Groenewald is one. Hugo Ras is one. There is a long list of Big Joe Nyalunga. There's a long list of about 10 alleged kingpins whose cases have yet to come to trial or who have been interminably delayed. And in some cases, I accept that that's because there is further investigative work being done in the background, which, fine, wait till the case is absolutely watertight, then bring to court. In other situations, I think it's because there is corruption masquerading as incompetence that means that the dockets get lost, witnesses fail to show, magistrates are ill. There's a particular case in KwaZulu-Natal that has been deferred, what is it, Julian, more than 20 times? And you begin to think, how many more excuses can you come up with? I mean, dog ate my homework isn't going to work on this one.
Julian, your thought on that just quickly, and I'll go back to Peter. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think Cathy's covered it well, and those are all major cases, some of which I wrote about back in 2012 that have still not been resolved. I think one of the things that we do also need to take into consideration here is that while on paper in a country like South Africa or in other countries, rhino poaching is something that is designated a priority crime by law enforcement, there are so many other priorities. South Africa has an incredibly high violent crime rate. We've seen skyrocketing incidents now that lockdowns are starting to be lifted of cash and transit heists, of heist targeting courier vehicles because people are now ordering in quite a lot. I think that there are issues of poverty. There are issues of people not having running water in their homes. Those are all going to be priority issues. And my fear in some ways is I think there's been a fair amount of progress done in highlighting this particular issue and raising awareness and the need for specialized investigations. A lot of that could actually be undone now because of all these other much greater challenges facing the country, particularly in the wake of COVID, and as South Africa battles with the economic fallout of COVID. But I think that those issues around corruption in prosecutions or when law enforcement dockets disappearing, all of that has been a major issue. And I think across the illicit supply chain, you see cases like that where they just simply disappear, or evidence simply disappears, and the case is called off. I think the most frightening example in South Africa is where you had a colonel in the Hawks, the Director of Priority Crime Investigation. He was murdered recently in an ambush, and Leroy Bruver, and he was gunned down. He was one of the leading investigators in organized crime, but particularly in high-level rhino poaching cases. The Big Joe Nyalunga case that Cathy mentioned earlier was one of the ones that he was involved in. And he was essentially assassinated. And I think that when law enforcement people of that seniority are being killed in targeted hits, you are moving into a completely new and terrifying level of disarray.
This actually, it come in the question that you pretty much have answered. It says, well, how do we improve success when it comes to prosecuting poachers or rhino horn traffickers? And you illustrated the problems there. Peter, maybe I could come back to you on that without giving away too much from your book, of course, how much you were able to delve into the issue of how the chain of command kind of scuppers any chance of success against the poaching on the ground.
Well, it does. And in the end, I suppose, if I go right to the geopolitical level, we suffer in the moment in the world, a world with very bad global leadership right across the board. I'm not going to get into names, but the big powers in the world are led by men who are basically doing their best to enrich themselves and those who support them, but not support everybody else. And we've got to get decent global leadership. We've got to get our own governments being led properly, and also working with Save the Rhino and working right across the board. And I don't think until we get that, we will really see the issues, for example, that Julian's just highlighted in South Africa, where the President Ramaphosa is trying to do his best, but it's against a backlog of a cancer in the system, which has crippled not just law enforcement agencies, but the way the administration is working. And so I hope that all those watching this, and by the way, to Raymond, I think, who asked the last question from South Africa, it's been published in the UK, The Rhino Conspiracy, by Muswell Press, but in South Africa, it'll be published in a month or so by Jonathan Ball, if you're interested in reading it.
All right, good to know. And actually, I want to sidetrack a little bit, Peter, on the writing process, how you were able to kind of switch off from all the stuff that you're having to do as a politician and someone who's very involved in what's going on in the political scene, to the actual mindset which allows you to write in a way that people can delve into it as a fictional thriller rather than, you know, always going back into a mindset that's more about reality.
Well, I suppose, Riz, because as I mentioned earlier, I read a lot of thrillers, right, and I like readable books, and therefore my style is to try and write a readable book, which people have been kind enough to say the Rhino Conspiracy is. In order to, and the way I've kind of worked, I've found space in a very busy life to do this, as a result of which I haven't read as many books as I'd want to. But I think for me, it is also about trying to convey the values, because in the end, the Save the Rhino campaign and what we're all discussing is about values and about putting into practice those values. And none of us are perfect, none of us are saints, but we can always try our best and ensure that those we elect to represent us do their best as well on right across the board. And those are the values that inspired me, led by Nelson Mandela, to get involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And it was a very tough struggle. People think apartheid was beaten off and Nelson Mandela became president, and it just happened. It was a long, tough struggle. And this campaign that Save the Rhino and others are leading is a tough battle, and you just got to keep at it. And I suppose writing the thriller was a bit of relief from the intensity of politics on a day-to-day basis.
I was thinking you really have to adjust your mindset. You know, it's something I always think about going as a journalist, writing the stuff that's there for, you know, so certainly for broadcasting, non-descriptive kind of stuff, suddenly having to put in adjectives and change the way you have to think.
Yeah, well, my wife Elizabeth's very strong on grammar. I'm a bit light on grammar, but I just tend to write in a way that I hope conveys the story in a page-turning fashion, which people have been kind enough to say this Rhino Conspiracy might do.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to that as well. I'm going to put a question here to Julian from Brian De Castro that has come in asking, are education efforts in China, Vietnam, etc., making any progress towards reducing demand for rhino horn, especially with the younger generations?
Yeah, I think again, you know, quite an area of some debate. There are a number of campaigns that have developed there over time. I think some have been better targeted than others. I think particularly some of the earlier campaigns to try and so-called demand reduction campaigns to get consumers to stop using these products sort of tended to pander to, or not pander, but tended to look at it through a prism, a sort of Western prism, and trying to help people, stop being so superstitious, stop using these things. I think some of the more modern campaigns have been a bit more sophisticated, but demand reduction campaigns are, just one of the arrows in the quiver. I think that it's a long-term effort. It's an extremely long-term effort. I think that the youth and the children are a particularly key point of contact, where if you can build up the kids of today, and if you can develop them, they will be the people that could lead in the future. I think that it's very hard to get sort of adults to change their minds very often, and particularly when you're dealing with a product that has the kind of value that rhino horn has. Where it's seen as not only a traditional medicine, but also as something that has an intrinsic investment value. So I think those elements. I think also on our side, on the African side, I think it's vital that we do also have engagements that are looking at the next generation of conservationists, of building up a next generation. I think we see, too many occasions where there are far too many sort of middle-aged white men in rooms discussing rhino poaching, and we're not looking at developing, the next level of Black African conservation, particularly in a place like South Africa, where, our skewed history and the racial disparities in South Africa have led to gaps, have led to the fact that, something like some of our premier national parks were closed off until quite late in the 1980s to many Black South Africans. So it's about building up that interest and developing this as a national asset that we as South Africans, for instance, take pride in. And I think similarly, in Vietnam and in China, and I think there is an awareness. I think that there are people in China. It's very easy to make one-size-fits-all judgment statements about China or Vietnam. Countries China, more than 1 billion people. There are people who are passionate and avid conservationists in China, and people who really care about these issues.
And of course, as you point out, the generational thing.
Just add one other brief thing, Riz, to what Julian said, and I completely agree. I think Save the Rhino has got 80,000 followers on Twitter. Each one of those followers is a potential campaigner to put pressure on their local MPs. You might be cynical about that, but you can't just leave it to others. We've all got to be an army of campaigners to put the pressure on in the best way we can. And to reinforce Julian's point, there is an issue that safaris and safari parks and game reserves are generally customized, visited by whites, largely from abroad, as I've done, or some in South Africa as well. And yet I have a character in my book who's a ranger, and who's saying, look, this is our heritage. I'm an African. I was born here. My father was brought up on this land. He taught me about wildlife. It's my land. It's my heritage. The wildlife are mine. And I think that voice needs to be heard as well.
The education aspect obviously is going to be a big thing, and generationally, as you touched on, Julian. I want to get a question across to Cathy that's come from Melissa Solly in the United Kingdom, who says, how do charities within South Africa and internationally collaborate? And is this something that you think needs to happen more? The idea that, of course, across borders, there might be better transfer of information and experience.
Absolutely, and it's one of the things that I've worked really hard at in my 19 years at Save the Rhino, is building good contacts with other NGOs. So, for example, we partner very closely with the International Rhino Foundation in the States, who we co-fund several projects together. We have monthly calls and discuss issues that come up. With Elise Serfontaine of StopRhinoPoaching.com, who I believe Peter and Julian have spoken to extensively. She's got great on-the-ground knowledge of what's happening in South Africa, particularly with Sam Parks in Kruger and in KZN. We work with WWF South Africa, Save African Rhinos Foundation. I had a call from my counterpart there this afternoon. That's an Australian organisation. We get together formally every 2 or 3 years. I'm a member of the IUCN African Rhino Specialist Group, and there are representatives from most of the big donor agencies there. And that's when we make plans together about how can we fill the gaps. We've all got different strengths, and and play to each other's strengths. Sometimes Save the Rhino might lead, sometimes it might be the IRF or WWF South Africa, but we all compare notes. I think actually that the Rhino donor agency community is a pretty close one.
Peter, there's a great question that came in for you just now, saying, was there anything that you struggled with when writing the book, especially when understanding the reality of the situation and sometimes the real examples that are currently ongoing?
Trying to get into the mindset. I mean, one of the characters in the book is a ranger who's actually being paid by the syndicate behind the poachers. And his sense of schizophrenia, if I can use that term in a neutral fashion, but his sense of being conflicted is a better term. On the one hand, he needs the money to provide the information about where the rhinos are and what's going on to be able to pay his kids' school fees. So he's a Black African ranger. On the other hand, he loves the wildlife. And so there's conflicting emotions in his mind the whole time. And I think apart from the venal criminals right at the top, I think for me, trying to understand and therefore remove the conditions where somebody like him could be conflicted. And the local Black African poachers are you know, it's their communities and they're risking their lives. And trying to understand that and to do something about it is something that I came to understand better than I'd ever thought about before.
I think for a lot of people outside that environment don't realize how difficult life is on the ground for the average person living in those conditions. And of course, you know, any kind of resource that might help feed the family and improve their lives might just become something irrespective of the consequences. I guess that's one of the things that gets highlighted. So, one of the things I was going to ask you, Julian, is looking at the situation with the pandemic, as you've been tracking what's been going on, how much of the kind of progress that might have occurred in the last couple of years in trying to curtail the trade, illegal trade of horn and wildlife products, how much of that has been undone by the pandemic?
I think let's start with a slightly optimistic note. I mean, I think that there has been strong indications of a fairly steady decline in poaching in recent years. That said, there's also been a fairly steady decline in rhino populations. A place like the Kruger National Park, particularly hard hit not only by poaching but also by drought in recent years. And we've seen declines in populations there. But rhino poaching has been coming down. I speak under correction, but I think in April this year, the Kruger National Park, for the first time in a number of years, did not have a single poaching incident recorded. So I think that there have been benefits from the hard lockdown.
Is that partly because of COVID, Julian?
Yeah, because of the hard lockdown that took place, and essentially completely shutting off the park, shutting off movements of people between provinces, movements of people across borders. So that hard lockdown had that impact. And we've seen that in many countries that have been hard locked, and there have been significant declines in all kinds of crime. Those are starting to pick up now as the lockdowns are eased. I think, you know, in that case, one of the biggest problems that the Kruger National Park's been dealing with are so-called drop-off poachings, where people would come into the park posing as tourists. A shooter would be dropped off somewhere in the bush, would go out, shoot a rhino, and then they'd leave the park with the weapon concealed and the horn concealed in the vehicle. So I think that's the one side of it. I think that it's been positive too in shining a spotlight on illegal wildlife trade more broadly. I think the real worry, though, is in terms of the economic impact, you know, and I think that we're starting to see the signs in South Africa, certainly, you know, joblessness numbers increasing dramatically, more people on the streets who are unemployed. You know, I think that it's only now starting to sink in. Restaurants that used to be open that are now closed, businesses that have collapsed. And I think those, you know, are becoming clearer and clearer. My concern, though, is that, you know, government with very few budgets, battling to try and deal with this, facing a sovereign debt crisis potentially in years to come, budget cutbacks are going to be the norm. And environmental departments tend not to be the most influential departments. They tend to be at the bottom of the food chain. The priorities are elsewhere. I think that also, in terms of capacity within law enforcement, focuses again are elsewhere. I think that there's, poverty on the ground. And we've seen in some instances anecdotal reports of increased snaring, increased bushmeat poaching by people desperate simply for food. So there's some very real challenges on the way. And I think that unless this is handled in the right way, there's a very good paper that came out recently that looked at methods to be employed. But unless we deal with that properly, I think so much of what's been achieved in the last decade could be undone.
The other problem, presumably, is a lot of these game reserves haven't had any visitors this year. And therefore, where's their income to protect the rhinos and other precious wildlife?
Peter, I was going to follow up on what Julian said, really about the way governments are having to re-budget and think about what to prioritize and how much you see potential damage being done to issues such as in wildlife protection and so on, because of course you and your colleagues are having to sit and discuss how to try to conserve other aspects of the economy.
Well, for example, the British government's talking about cutting the international aid budget because there's so much pressure on and international aid budget. There will be some projects that are actually about wildlife conservation. So that's a really big problem, and we've all got to campaign to try and protect that. We've had I won't get too political, Riz, but we've had an era now, decades, of a neoliberal economic system where actually public spending has been regarded as a bad thing. Cutting taxes for those at the top has been regarded as a good thing, privatizing everything as a good thing. And actually, whether it's elderly care or whether it's conserving our wildlife, our species, and ultimately, our ecosystem that humankind depends upon, you need public investment and you need governments willing to spend. And countries in Africa just don't have the budgets. And the other thing that I think is so important about this, and COVID has dramatically highlighted this, is we're all interlinked. Yeah. Every country, every person is all interlinked, and climate change and the threat that poses has demonstrated that dramatically. But it is true of this agenda as well. We can't just, have a moan about corruption in South Africa or wherever it might be. Actually, we're all responsible in one way or another, and our governments are too.
Cathy, I'm going to put a question to you. Obviously, I guess a lot of people don't realize that loss of natural habitat is another reason that rhinos struggle. And the question came saying, is it possible to move rhinos into a new landscape like that, the Cerrados or forests of Brazil?
Oh gosh, there are all those wonderful stories about the Pablo Escobar's hippos breeding and escaping and creating havoc in Colombia. Good question. I mean, we focus on in situ conservation, and I mean that by that I mean that we work on rhino conservation in the natural rhino range states. They've got the habitat, and it's about rhinos. Yes, they are a fabulous species, and people talk about them as umbrella or flagship or keystone species. But actually, the important bit is that they're part of their ecosystem. And you have all these other species, whether it's cheetahs or dung beetles or whatever, who depend on a symbiotic with the landscape that rhinos shape. The big thing about being such a big animal, creating wallows, opening up dense brush, is that enables other species to share the same environment. So just taking a bunch of rhinos and putting them, whether it's in Australia or Brazil, it's not really the point. Rhinos are there as representatives, if you like, these wild chunks of Africa and Asia. Let's not forget India and Nepal and Indonesia that have also got the 3 Asian rhino species. It's really about the whole ecosystem.
And I think that's one of the key things that's come out in the pandemic, that we are all interlinked and you can't really tamper with nature too much. One thing I wanted to ask...
all the time, yeah.
Sure, yeah. Julian, your book was 2012. Do you see any updates on the horizon? Have you got anything in the pipeline as far as writing?
Well, I've been working in the last couple of years, mainly initially with Traffic, the International Wildlife Trade work around looking at a variety of issues, including rhinos, but also abalone and so on. My work at the moment is centered primarily around organized crime more broadly in East and Southern Africa. But there are a lot of crossovers between them. You know, if you're looking at smuggling of rhino horn or ivory, and other illicit goods, drugs, for instance, we're seeing some of the same ports being used, similar routes being used. So there's been a lot of work around that that's taking place, and you know, work that we're planning to expand on. We're doing a couple of studies at the moment, looking at a number of illicit wildlife markets, and looking at how those markets function.
So I'm going to, before I wrap up with Peter, I'm just going to squeeze in a quick question that just came in, Cathy, to you from Gianna Leaves, who says, how can ordinary people, in quotations, help the rhino cause best? Is it donations, raising awareness? Well,
yeah, it's all of those, Riz. And our website, savetherhino.org, has lots of suggestions under how to get involved. I had never run a marathon until I joined Save the Rhino, and then I suddenly realized that we've got this awful reputation, and now I've got 7 ordinary and 3 ultra marathons under my belt. I've done my own share of fundraising. I know what it's like setting up your Just Giving or your Virgin Money giving page. I think it's also important to be informed of the facts and hot issues. We've touched on quite a few of them tonight. And again, our website, if you go to Rhino Info, I'd strongly recommend you look at a section called Thorny Issues. We go into dehorning, into corruption, the impact of COVID, legal trade. Rhino conservation is endlessly fascinating. I can't tell you how much the picture has changed in the 19 years I've been here and how much more there's still to learn. It's a really great example of all the big controversies in conservation. I don't want people to get depressed by thinking, gosh, there are people who can't agree with each other on whether to trade or not. We are all wanting the same thing. And I think it's really important to remember that. We want to see all 5 species of rhino thriving in the wild with benefits for the people who work directly with them and indirectly. And, you know, that's a pretty good thing to aim for.
Well, Peter, a final question, and it's a bit strange to ask you this just literally a few days before your book comes out, officially is released. But anything in the pipeline? Has the Rhino Conspiracy given you the bug to write some more fictional thriller work?
Well, maybe. It's been suggested by Muswell Press, the publishers, that I might look at this, but we'll have to see how this goes first. So it's also, as I said, being published by Jonathan Ball in South Africa. But I loved writing it, and I felt there was a really important cause at the bottom of this, and that's why it's such a privilege to be working with Save the Rhino on this particular event. And thank you, Cathy, and your staff, because if I got one message, it is that in the end, you do not change things by relying on people at the top alone. I've been both a protester on the streets and sometimes still am, and a government minister inside the system. You need both. And so everybody can be a foot soldier to Save the Rhino. Everybody can be involved in whatever way they think they can. And if collectively you can move things. You know, when we started to try and stop the all-white South African sports tours 50 years ago, people said you couldn't do it. We did, by non-violent direct action in invading rugby pitches and cricket pitches and stopped them. And in the end, you've now got a non-racial sports system. It's not perfect in South Africa. You can change things. Don't just sit back and have a pop at everybody else. Try to get involved would be my message.
I have to say, you know, your life alone, you know, you being at the pointy end of the stick a few times from the authorities, it'd be great to read the Hain Conspiracy with a question mark at the end of it.
There's quite a lot of that, getting a letter bomb from the South African security
right.
and so on and things like that. But,
with faulty wiring, I gather. So
yeah, fortunately, I wouldn't be on your Zoom call.
Well, Peter, congratulations. 10th of September, the Rhino Conspiracy gets released. Julian Rademeyer, thank you so much. And Cathy, always a pleasure. Thanks very much to Save the Rhino International for hosting this. SaveTheRhino.org if you want more information, as Cathy indicated. Thank you so much for joining us from so many corners of the world. It was great to have you on board with us and with all those questions that came in. Do keep your eyes open for the next webinar as we have it. Great to have you with us. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.